Hello, this is Wobbly Wallaby. A question I often seen is what class should I choose or what class should I multiclass to? In this video, I'll go in depth into 4 popular classes and give reasons as to why I think these are great choices. The 4 classes I'll go over in detail are Stellar Hunter, Spirit Whisperer, Novice Guardian, and Lightbringer. In Ragnarok Mobile, I like to play classes that can carry weekly instances and boss hunt. If you like support classes like Saint or Divine Avenger, then choose those. You can always multi-class to these 4 classes later. Also, I'm going to focus on PvE only since I'm only playing PvP casually. I can't provide much analysis on that. You may have noticed that no magic classes are mentioned. In general, I don't like the playstyle for magic classes. When compared to physical classes, I feel like they are more expensive to build early and late game. They also can't use damage from size or type modifiers, which physical classes can get. Many physical classes can also do elemental conversions in their skills or attacks, whereas magic classes are locked to a certain elemental type. I prefer the flexibility of physical classes. Don't get me wrong, magic classes are very strong. It just isn't my style, so I haven't played in depth to be able to provide some good commentary. First, I will discuss my experience with each class before doing comparison. Stellar Hunter was the first class I started with. I liked being ranged for farming, and the DPS was good for some weekly instances. Currently, this is my main farming class, and Stellar Hunter is considered to be one of the best farming classes in the game. It's very flexible due to its fast attack speed, long range, and meteor fission skill, which can hit 3 monsters at once. Stellar Hunters have dominated the newer maps like Moonlight Grotto and various Komodo maps. Some other top farming classes like Begetter requires closely clumped monsters and fast spawning. On a lot of newer maps, these conditions are not met, so it's a lot harder for Begetters to farm efficiently. The last popular Begetter map was in Plains of Ida. Unless you keep your character at level 140 to avoid a large level gap, then Begetter doesn't farm very well on the newer maps. You can keep your character at level 140 by creating an alternate character and never doing the character reincarnation quest. The other top farming class is Tyrant. Tyrant can beat Stellar Hunter in farming if you get lucky on the S-Ruin Flightfire Shooting Star. You need the 3rd line and a high percentage on the 1st line. I find Tyrant's ability to farm too dependent on this ruin, so I prefer Stellar Hunter who has a guaranteed multi-kill attack option. Also, I find one-shotting with both auto attack and the homing missile bullets to be much harder than Stellar Hunter. For homing missile, you need ignore defense and skill damage, so your gear needs to be both good for auto attack and ignore defense plus skill damage. As a result, you need a balance of both, which is harder than Stellar Hunter where you only need to focus on auto attack. Although Stellar Hunter is amazing for farming, I find Stellar Hunter struggles to carry instances like Thanatos Tower or Ponape Museum. With refined 10 gear, the DPS just wasn't enough for me. Boss hunting was also really bad due to the lack of burst damage. If I was going to invest hundreds of millions of Zeny into a good boss hunting build for Stellar Hunter, I would rather invest in a class with better Zeny to damage ratio. I moved on to Spirit Whisperer next. What drew me to Spirit Whisperer was his HP to damage skill called Life Soul. Even without good handbook deposits or gear, you can do a lot of damage. I used this for PvE and boss hunting, and it worked great for around a year. The DPS difference between Spirit Whisperer and Stellar Hunter with the same refine level was much better. I was able to carry instances that I couldn't do before because Spirit Whisperers have some great Zeny to damage returns. Spirit Whisperer is well rounded and I love playing it, but I've heard people say that it doesn't excel in anything. I agree, it has lots of useful tools but is outmatched in burst damage, DPS, and farming by other classes. During this year, I started doing Thanatos Tower and Oracle Nightmare, which often require high DPS. I saw Novice Guardians dominating and wanted to be capable of carrying. My Spirit Whisperer had hit a DPS ceiling that requires very expensive gear to progress further. Instead of investing more than 1 billion Zeny on Spirit Whisperer, I invested in Novice Guardian after months of rolling for the required ruins. The Novice Guardian DPS did not disappoint, and now I use it for PvE and boss hunting. I can also help carry people, which was always my goal. Novice Guardian has very high DPS to Zeny returns, but is very dependent on getting the ruins. I think this is the most busted class in the game due to the Ruthless Slash Ruin, which grants you absolute ignore defense regardless of the enemy's defense. Also, the Swift Storm Star Ruin, which can double your damage output if you're standing next to the target. Also, there's a massive amount of ruins that can contribute towards your cart tornado damage. I was lucky to get both the required ruins, and my Novice Guardian is my main class now. It has made carrying weekly instances much easier, and I like the playstyle where I can quickly run up to something and melt it. Next, I had Multiclass to my LB on my main account recently. I had experience with LB with my alt and slave, but I found the damage underwhelming since those accounts lack guild blessings and deposits. People often ask if Spirit Whisperer is better than Lightbringer. I wanted to give a better answer by trying it out myself. Lightbringer Burst is insane. Without Refined 15 gear, you can one-shot MVPs. I can see why people recommended Lightbringer for boss hunting, since it has very high Zeny to DPS returns. Lightbringer can also farm very well due to its skills. It has great passive skills for farming and earning more Zeny, such as Overprice, Fundraising, and Greed. It also has good AoE options with Arm Cannon and AI farming. However, even after playing with Lightbringer, I still prefer the DPS of Novice Guardian and the Novice Guardian playstyle, since it's much more simplistic. Next, I'll be doing some comparisons so you get a better idea of which class suits you the best. First is newly accelerated level 120 farming. If you want to know what farming will be like for the first 3 weeks of the game, this is my tier list. If you create a newly accelerated character in ROM 2.0, Cell Hunter gets a lot of Zeny. Getting AoE farming early on and facing relatively weak monsters, you'll be able to excel early on. Cell Hunter is definitely S tier. Next, Spirit Whisperer are A tier. They're great since they can use AoE farming, and the damage is easy since it's dependent on your HP. With my newly accelerated Spirit Whisperer, I found it very easy to one-shot everything and easily progress through tougher monsters. Lightbringer is also A tier. It can rely on its passives to help it earn more Zeny. You can either use single target knuckle boost or the arm cannon AoE, which will cost you shells. The secret to early game farming is to save up for Saint's Cape, which will greatly increase its damage. Next, Physical Novice Guardian farming is terrible. It's not a farming class, so it does poorly. It has no good AoE options for farming. Next, here's the tier list for farming late game. This would be for level 160 and higher. Stellar Hunters are one of the best farming classes late game. For endgame farming locations like the Komodo maps and Moonlight Grotto, it excels on those maps. I find it to be one of the most flexible classes since you can easily farm the new maps. You also can attack quickly, and you don't rely on fixed monster spawn spots for efficient farming like a Begetter does. One note about Stellar Hunter is that you need to do your weekly instances, otherwise farming high-level maps will be hard. My free-to-play newly accelerated Stellar Hunter has struggled to get good damage because it wasn't in an active guild. Only recently did I join the guild Hellkite on Destiny's Promise that I got help with weekly PvE content, get prayer cards from occupation chests, and use guild facilities which are of higher level. This really helped me progress my character. Spirit Whisperer and Lightbringer have great AoE options. Spirit Whisperer farming continues to be easy due to its HP influencing your damage. As your Lightbringer gets stronger, you can use AI with Photon Cannon, which lets your robot farm while you're also farming at the same time. I put both into A tier, although Lightbringer will be better than Spirit Whisperer, but Lightbringer Zeny won't be S tier. Novice Guardian continues to be terrible at farming, so does C tier. Next is a tier list for early game PvE. I put the timeline as the first 2 months of playing this game. When you do weekly PvE instances like Endless Tower, Valhalla Ruins, and Echoing Corridor, it can be tough for new players. Unless you have friends or guildmates that can carry you, it will be tough. Spirit Whisper's AoE and high damage makes it ideal for PvE early game. Cell Hunters also do decent damage, but it heavily relies on people helping to tank since your HP will be low. I put Lightbringer and Novice Guardian lower at B tier, because early game, the required ruins and the guild buffs aren't there yet, so their damage will be very underwhelming. Next is a tier list for mid to late game PvE. Novice Guardian is one of the most dominating PvE classes in the game. I use it for tough weekly instances like Thanatos Tower, Punami Museum, and Oracle Dungeon. I've also seen fellow Zenith guildmates carry those with Lightbringer, and also have very high damage output. Both of these classes are S tier. I put Spirit Whisperer lower at A tier because his DPS late game is very expensive. Without plus 15 refined items or expensive cards, his damage can't compete with Lightbringer or Novice Guardian. I put Cell Hunter lower at B tier because I find that without plus 15 equipment or gear that costs hundreds of millions of Zeny, Cell Hunter damage just isn't high enough to compete with other classes. Also, the other classes can also solo better since they have high survivability and damage. Stellar Hunters need to balance their stats between Agi, Dex, and Luck. It's very hard to put a lot of vitality into the stats. Next is the tier list for boss hunting. Lightbringer excels at burst damage. Even without refined 15 gear, you can nuke bosses, which makes it very good in competitive boss hunting channels. Among the 4 classes, I say this is the cheapest class to achieve one-shotting bosses on the MVP board. Next, Novice Guardian is really good at taking down high-end monsters due to its DPS. It also moves very fast, so it's easier for you to find bosses quickly to kill it. My Spirit Whisperer was able to one-shot everything up to Stormy Night, but beyond that, it starts to get difficult. Lightbringer is definitely better for nuking MVPs than Spirit Whisperer for harder bosses. Cell Hunters do show up on the MVP boards, so they are quite popular. However, I found it hard to hunt without party members. I can solo hunt with other classes, but I find I struggled with Cell Hunter. I found using Slave Priest for buffs, heal, and Faith Prey helped a lot. Also, having a Slave Ruin Master for a bit of tanking and additional buffs helps as well. Next is the tier list for good Zeny to damage returns. Novice Guardian and Lightbringer can do very well with just refined 10 gear. Spirit Whisperer can do well with refined 10 gear too, but is not as good as the other two. For refined 10 gear, I found the Stellar Hunter just wasn't good enough to compete with other classes for damage output. If all classes are using refined 15 gear, I think this tier list remains unchanged. It's just the nature of the class's skills that make it so strong. Next, what would I recommend? If you're new and going to accelerate a character to level 120 and 4th job, then I would suggest the following. If you don't plan on doing many weekly instances or can't be carried, I would suggest Spirit Whisperer. Early to mid game, I can do very well due to how strong this class is and how its AoE can do very well in PvE content. If you will do lots of weekly instances and can be carried by others, I would suggest Lightbringer or Stellar Hunter. Having a Stellar Hunter that is strong enough to farm means that you can always earn enough Zeny to support whatever character you'd like in the future. Stellar Hunters are one of the best classes to multiclass to. If you can afford to gear up a Stellar Hunter, then it's ideal to switch to it for farming. If you're playing this game long term, you need a good farming class to give you lots of Zeny each day. Next is Lightbringer. Overall, it's a really good class for damage mid to late game. It's also very playable even without certain S or S-star ruins, whereas for Novice Guardian, it's not. My free-to-play Lightbringer account wasn't hitting very hard, and that's because the skill buffs are very low. Also, the penetration percentage, the ignore defense percentage, and attacks makes a huge difference, When I finally multiclassed on my main, I could see why people like Lightbringer due to how strong the Pioneer and Machine Revelations are for nuking bosses. When it comes to one-shotting bosses on the MVP board, it doesn't disappoint. Novice Guardian is a character I would multiclass to. It's highly dependent on its ruins. So, you'll need to do Echoing Corridor, Thanatos Tower, and events to try to roll for these required star ruins. If you don't have these, it's very difficult to play optimally. I personally think this class is busted, and mid to late game, its DPS is unmatched for the amount of Zeny you need to invest. It's very efficient since Cartornado has many multipliers. I also know many people who have multi-classed to Novice Guardian from Spirit Whisperer, Lightbringer, and other classes. I think once you play or see this class in action, you can see how unfair it is. My transition from Spirit Whisperer main to Novice Guardian was fairly smooth, and I've never gone back to Spirit Whisperer for PvE after. I hope you got a better idea of which class you should choose or multi-class to in Ragnarok Mobile. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe.